Why did ancient scribes facing plagues, infant death, and midnight terrors choose to paint blood-drinkers as demons, rather than mere monsters? Could it be that the Bible's world, haunted by night creatures, already had a language for predators who drain life at the margins of light? Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Demonology. Before cinema sharpened fangs and capes, the Near Eastern night was already crowded. In Sumer, Lamashtu stalked mothers. In Akkad, the Utka rode fever. In Egypt, Sekhmet's thirst rose with plague heat. In Greece, Lama lured with a smile that cut like a knife. When Hebrew prophets warned of lands turned to wasteland, they listed what the dark keeps. Wild cats shall meet with hyenas, and Lilith shall settle there. Isaiah 34 verse 14. No capes here, only a taxonomy of dread. Scripture framed life as sacred substance, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Leviticus 17 verse 11. Steal blood, steal life. Name a creature that feeds on life and you've named a theological crime, not just a predator. That's why the boundary between demon and vampire blurred. The category that mattered was desecration, an assault on the breath God loans to flesh. Communities answered desecration with barriers. Folklore braided apotropaic craft to commandment. Garlic on lintels, salt in bowls, thorns on roofs, iron at thresholds, mirrors facing outward to bounce the intruder back into the void. A broom behind the door to trap the mind. That must count. Every bristle, every grain until dawn rescues the house. The ritual logic is ancient. Separate holy from unclean. Protect life from drain. Even proverb poets knew the hunger that never says enough. The leech has two daughters. Give and give. Proverbs 30:15. In a world where blood equals being, these countermeasures weren't quaint. They were counter-liturgy. Street-level theology. Crosses rose later as a weaponized creed, but the grammar is older. Light against night, sanctity against appetite. The living refusing to be tithed by the grave. By the time Eastern Europe whispered of Strigoi slipping as mist through keyholes, the church had already stocked a reliquary arsenal. Wood stakes spoke the language of trees and crosses. Holy water answered pestilence with blessing. Iron contested enchantment with earth's backbone. The body became a battlefield of signs. Testimony against nocturnal feeders is not forensic. It is confessional. To drink blood is to invert worship, swapping altar for throat. Small wonder storytellers reach for demonology, not zoology, when naming the threat. And while tales multiplied, wolves, bats, owls, even the hopping jang abroad, the biblical lens kept snapping into place. Keep blood off your lips. Keep death out of your house. Keep covenant at the doorway like a sword of light. Exodus 12 verse 7-23. Yet the Bible's horror is subtler than a scream. It studies the night's psychology, the tug of forbidden hunger, the ache that prowls the human fence line. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. 1 Peter 5 feet 8 inches. Seeks more. Lamia's gaze. Strigoi's thirst. Different masks, same grammar of. Devouring. When mothers braid thorns or hang mirrors, when elders trace signs. Over doorposts, they're not acting from ignorance but memory. Life is loaned and debts come calling after sunset. The old names Lilith Utuku became shorthand for everything that feeds on grief. So the vampire wore a demon's passport because only a demon could justify the full liturgy of resistance. Prayer, symbol, boundary, and the stubborn hope that night has a limit. Listen to the long thunder of the prophets and hear the hook for what waits beyond the lamp's rim. When they say to you, consult the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter. Should not a people inquire of their God to the teaching and to the testimony? If they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. They will pass through the land greatly distressed and hungry, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. Music. Creation. The myths of creatures who fed upon the living were not confined to one land or language. Across the cradle of civilization, from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, tales circulated of night wanderers who drained vitality in ways that resembled both disease and desire. In Sumer, tablets spoke of Lamashtu, the she-demon who targeted mothers and infants, a predator who stalked where new life was most fragile. To the Babylonians, the Utku embodied the terror of possession, slipping into bodies to cause wasting illness. These accounts, far older than later European folklore, frame the idea of vampiric beings not as romantic monsters, but as divine punishments or demonic afflictions. Each story emphasized the invasion of life's sanctity, marking blood and breath as sacred gifts that could be stolen. When Egyptians wrote of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess with a thirst that only rivers of blood could appease, the boundaries blurred again between deity, plague, and predator. Greek tradition added yet another layer with the Lamia, a figure torn between seduction and monstrosity. She could disguise herself in beauty, but beneath the facade lay the hunger of a serpent. A creature whose curse was directed at children and youth. The Greeks, masters of weaving myth into moral warning, painted Lamia not as random horror, but as embodiment of unchecked desire, her feast on innocence, reflecting fears about corruption and violation. In later centuries, Slavic tales of Strigoi offered a darker, colder picture. Corpses that rose from graves to stocken, shifting into wolves, owls, or vapors that seeped through cracks in homes. The Strigoi were not isolated spirits, but persistent reminders that death itself could refuse to stay buried. Unlike the older demon myths, these beings bore closer resemblance to what later Europe would name vampires. Not spirits of fever or divine wrath, but bodies animated again to consume their own. In the East, China gave form to the Jiang, corpses stiffened by death, into hopping terrors, hair grown wild, claws sharpened, faces pale as bone. They were not subtle seducers, but grotesque figures of contagion, stalking communities at night with unrelenting hunger. Legends insisted that yellow talismans pinned to their foreheads rendered them inert. A ritual reminder that human order could still restrain chaos. In Mesoamerica, the mayor spoke of Kamzat, a monstrous bat demon dwelling in the underworld, swooping above ground to taste human blood. This terrifying image blurred the divide between predator animal and supernatural fiend, emphasizing the night sky as domain of danger. In Japan, the Ur-ghosts sustained not by flesh but by the essence of the living added spectral dread. Their pale bodies trailing hair drained vigor rather than veins, but the result was the same. Life diminished by contact with death's residue. These stories scattered across continents converged in one shared conviction. Life was fragile, and something in the dark sought to steal it. Latin America centuries later would produce its own frightful presence in the form of the chupacabra, a reptilian beast rumored to pierce livestock and drain them dry. Unlike older demons sanctified by temple or scripture, this creature belonged to whispered accounts of peasants born in fear and sustained in rumor. In India, the Vitala animated corpses, bending the bodies of the dead to torment the living. Possession, manipulation, the perversion of the natural cycle. These threads tied the stories together. Whether through the cry of a newborn stolen in Sumer, the child haunted in Greece, or the herds left bloodless in the Americas, the same terror persisted. Humanity confronted the sense that death did not end hunger. It could twist into a second existence, parasitic and relentless. Ancient belief systems, whether polytheistic or animist, shared in their acknowledgement that what preyed in the night was not just beast, but symbol, an emblem of disorder and divine wrath pressed upon human fear. Folkloric practices grew alongside these myths, offering fragile shields against the night. In Slavic regions, garlic hung in doorways became more than a crop. It was a talisman against intrusion. A plant thought to carry purification strong enough to repel what desecrated blood. Brooms placed behind thresholds. Bowls of salt scattered across floors. Mirrored doors facing outward all acted as obstacles, exploiting the supposed compulsions of predators. A vampire forced to count each grain to stumble before a reflection to recoil at consecrated iron. Such was the logic of folk defenses in Romania. Villagers laid thorns and wild roses upon rooftops, for a Strigoi could not pass without tearing itself to pieces. Elsewhere in Africa, salt rings around villages promised to encircle homes with purity that foul spirits could not breach. In China, mirrors reflected horror back upon itself, driving away. These customs were not empty superstitions, but desperate strategies. The people's way of imposing order on a universe they felt was forever slipping toward chaos. Beyond physical barriers, ritual and prayer fortified belief. Some communities blessed bread or garments, carrying them as safeguards against the unclean. Others relied on charms recited in night vigils, chants that promised to bind the hungry dead. The use of holy water, crosses, or relics reflected not only Christian expansion, but an older instinct. The sacred must be wielded against the profane. A wooden stake was not only an executioner's tool, but a symbol of the tree, rooted, natural, sacred, piercing the corruption that pretended to be life. Across continents, even where Christianity had not reached, the principle repeated. Symbols rooted in faith, objects drawn from earth or ritual, could repel what threatened the fragile boundary of human breath. The convergence of these beliefs from Egypt to China reveals something deeper than coincidence. Wherever people believed blood equaled life, they also feared what would steal it. And wherever they feared, they created rituals to resist, weaving together a language of protection that crossed both geography and theology. Long before the Gothic novels of Europe, these ancient tales gave substance to the night. They taught that predators of spirit and flesh were inseparable from divine judgment and communal memory. Myths of Sekhmet, Lamashtu, Lamia, and Strigoi are not curiosities but ancestral commentaries on fragility, mortality, and the dread that death is not absolute. What united them was not their form, bat, lioness, ghost, or corpse, but their function. The violation of life's sanctity through hunger. Whether recorded in uniform, painted upon tomb walls, or whispered beside fires, the stories named something that modern terms like vampire only half contain. The ancients spoke of demons because demons alone encompassed the terror that appetite could outlive the grave, and that night silence held more than sleep. And so their myths endured, whispering into later centuries, feeding the roots from which the vampire of literature and film would eventually rise. One ancient voice captures the solemn terror most clearly, its words echoing through cultures that feared the devouring dark. They shall be as when a hungry man dreams he is eating and awakes with his hunger not satisfied, or as when a thirsty man dreams he is drinking and awakes faint with his thirst not quenched. Isaiah 29 verse 8. This scripture is not merely poetry but prophecy of endless appetite. An image of hunger that never dies. From Mesopotamian demons to European revenants, this endless hunger is the thread binding centuries of myth, preparing the ground for the more terrifying portraits that would come later. Music, when Europe entered the long shadows of true horror. The medieval centuries, stories of the undead acquired a new urgency. Across the fields of Transylvania and the villages of Wallachia, rumors grew of bodies that refused to rest, rising from their graves to torment the living. Fear was sharpened by disease and sudden death, as outbreaks of plague or tuberculosis were often blamed on a restless corpse, drinking vitality from its family. The villagers, desperate for an explanation, turned to rituals of exhumation. Coffins were opened, bodies examined for signs of unnatural preservation, and if the heart seemed too fresh, the solution was brutal. A wooden stake driven deep, or a head severed to silence the hunger. These practices were not mere cruelty, but acts of communal survival, attempts to contain invisible forces that science could not yet name. For them, the grave did not always close the story. It sometimes opened it. The 16th and 17th centuries became the crucible in which vampire law solidified. Reports of nocturnal attacks spread across Eastern Europe, sparking both terror and fascination. To many, the vampire was no longer only a whispered myth, but a threat documented in local chronicles. It was believed these revenants could assume shapes of animals, slipping through shadows as bats or wolves, or dissolving into mist to enter locked houses. The fear was amplified by the sense of contagion. One victim could become another predator, spreading the curse across generations. Scholars of the time often dismissed these reports. Yet their persistence revealed a society gripped by dread. The rituals of staking, decapitation, or burning became liturgies of reassurance, reminding the people that death could still be commanded if the community acted in unity. Each destroyed corpse became a kind of exorcism, a visible answer to the invisible terror haunting their nights. In the late 18th century, the vampire entered the consciousness of Western Europe through reports that shocked polite society. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated tales of peasants digging up bodies, convinced that their kin were rising at night to drain the life from the village. These accounts fascinated Enlightenment readers who often ridiculed the peasants for their superstition, but at the same time could not resist the thrill of the grotesque. The vampire thus became a paradoxical figure, both a symbol of ignorance and a source of fascination. Intellectuals debated whether such beliefs revealed a primitive fear of death or a cultural memory too deeply rooted to be erased. For the common folk, however, there was nothing abstract about it. Hunger, sickness, and death were real, and naming the cause gave them a sense of control. The vampire became a mirror of the age, mocked by philosophers, feared by villagers, and slowly transforming into a figure of cultural imagination. Literature seized upon this moment, transforming scattered folklore into structured narrative. John Polidori's tale, The Vampire, published in the early 19th century, marked a turning point. His character, Lord Ruthven, was no longer a grotesque corpse, but a nobleman with charm and sinister allure. With this invention, the vampire entered salons and drawing rooms, shedding the earth of peasant graves to inhabit the elegance of aristocracy. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmela deepened the transformation, intertwining dread with themes of desire and seduction, creating a creature whose menace was inseparable from beauty. These works shaped the modern form of the vampire, a being not only of terror but of temptation, a predator who ensnared rather than assaulted. Literature reframed the figure from a rural superstition into a universal symbol of corruption, desire, and mortality. In these pages, the vampire gained a permanence it had never possessed in scattered folklore, entering the imagination of an entire civilization. Yet, the true cultural earthquake came with Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in the late 19th century. Here, the myth crystallized into its most enduring form, a transient count who blended aristocratic refinement with predatory hunger. Dracula was both ancient and modern, rooted in folklore, yet adapted to the anxieties of a rapidly changing world. His arrival in London symbolized fears of invasion, contamination, and the collapse of boundaries between old and new. The story gave us not only the archetype of the vampire, but also its hunter, Professor Van Helsing, who embodied the blend of science and faith used to combat darkness. Stoker's novel was more than fiction. It was a cultural document that preserved centuries of fear, clothed in the garments of Gothic storytelling. In Dracula, the vampire became eternal, not only because of its immortality within the tale, but because the story itself would never again vanish from human imagination. The fascination with blood, central to every version of the myth, is what bound these tales across centuries. To drink blood was to rob a person of life, to seize what was considered sacred essence. The Bible had long warned, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and that law echoed unconsciously in the horror of these stories. To imagine a creature who lived by consuming blood was to imagine a being who committed the greatest transgression, stealing the very spark of existence. It is this symbolic weight that gave the vampire its enduring power. Across graves, villages, novels, and eventually films, the same thread ran true. The vampire does not merely kill, it desecrates. That violation of life's core became its most terrifying feature. And it is why Even in the most modern retellings, blood remains not only sustenance, but the sacred prize of the night. The chronicles of Eastern Europe testify to this deep entanglement of body, faith, and fear. They dug him up and found his face ruddy, as though he had drunk blood. So they drove a stake through his heart, and at last he rested. Such reports may seem like macabre exaggerations, but they illustrate the union of belief and ritual, the certainty that terror could be defeated by decisive action. Blood on the lips of the dead became the ultimate proof of transgression, the visible mark of invisible sin. The community's response, though violent, was also an assertion of order, restoring balance by punishing the one who refused to remain in the grave. These acts, half ritual, half desperation, show us how the vampire became both symbol and scapegoat, bearing the weight of fears too great to name. From these moments, the mythology entered history, and history in turn preserved the myth. Even centuries later, scholars recognize that the vampire myth reflects the primal terror of humanity, the fear that death does not end hunger and that the grave may not protect us from violation. The vampire is not merely a monster but a metaphor for plague, corruption, and forbidden desire. As one chronicler of Eastern Europe observed, they believed, and so they acted, and in their belief, the dead were truly dangerous. This conviction gave rise to the rituals and to the stories that outlived them. In every culture, the vampire evolved, reshaping itself to mirror the anxieties of its time. But always beneath each transformation, the hunger for blood remained, uniting all tales across centuries. It is this hunger, insatiable, transgressive, and intimate, that ensures the vampire's presence in our collective memory. As the stories moved from graveside to literature, from scripture to superstition, blood was always the thread, always the proof, and always the price. Music. Bloodlust. As the 20th century opened its doors to new art forms, the vampire was no longer bound to parchment or whispered folklore. It now belonged to the stage and the screen. The silent era gave us Nosferatu, the film that redefined horror with its skeletal figure of Count or his rodent-like teeth and shadow stretching across the walls created an image that audiences could not erase from memory. Unlike the seductive nobleman of novels, this vampire was disease embodied, a plague in human form. The power of the film lay not only in its eerie story, but also in its use of light and shadow, showing that fear could be magnified through imagery. The influence of Nosferatu echoed for decades, inspiring countless depictions that favored monstrosity over elegance. Cinema had transformed the vampire into a universal nightmare, and its shadow fell across all cultures touched by the screen. When Bela Lugos donned the black cape in the early sound era, the vampire entered a new realm of immortality. His accent, his hypnotic gaze, and the theatrical delivery of every line turned Dracula into a figure both terrifying and strangely alluring. The image of the vampire as a suave aristocrat became so fixed that later generations often imagined no other form. With Hollywood's reach, the myth spread globally, and what had once been the terror of isolated villages now haunted theaters from New York to Tokyo. Stage productions, novels, and films drew upon Lugosi's performance, making his Dracula a standard against which all others would be measured. This transition proved that myth, once it became art, could transcend its cultural boundaries. Dracula was no longer merely a character in Stoker's novel. He had become an icon of fear itself, polished and projected for a world that was eager to embrace darkness. The mid-19th century saw a reimagining through the hands of Hammer Films, where Christopher Lee's portrayal draped the vampire in both violence and sensuality. His crimson eyes, his towering presence, and his menacing fangs brought a new intensity that older adaptations lacked. These films emphasized blood in vivid color, a shocking sight for audiences unprepared for such brutality on screen. Lee's Dracula was not only a predator, but also a symbol of temptation and carnal power, reflecting the shifting social climate of the time. The Gothic sets and lavish costumes contrasted with the primal savagery of his attacks, reinforcing the duality that has always defined the myth. Hammer's productions elevated the vampire into both spectacle and allegory, embodying repressed desires and unspoken fears.